Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, How to Plan an Office 365 Enterprise Deployment. This is your host, Etisham Hussain. I'm with Ashish Thakuri. He is a Microsoft certified trainer who specializes in Microsoft Azure, Office 365, Exchange Server, and a number of other Microsoft technologies. He has been teaching for the last 6 years. And today he's gonna uh, teach us all about planning an Office 365 enterprise deployment. So we are looking forward to a very educational session here. Over to you, Ashish.
All right, thank you very much, Etisham, for that quick and crisp introduction. So once again, very good afternoon, good morning, good evening from whichever part of the world you're joining in this session from. As Etisham said, I'll be your host for today's session, wherein we'll be discussing how to plan an Office 365 enterprise deployment. So Office 365 or any of the other Microsoft Cloud stack, be it Azure or any of their SaaS offerings, we are talking about whether it's Azure Active Directory or Intune, is something that I have been working on for years now, almost a decade, if I were to say, starting off from how to deploy them in on-prem to now utilizing the cloud flavor and evangelizing and educating people on the same. So when you think of Office 365, right? So it's a SaaS service, it's a managed service, and usually the understanding, usually the misconception, I'd say, would be that since it's a SaaS offering, there's not a lot required to be done from our end, right? But when you talk, so if you notice carefully, the session's title is the enterprise deployment, right? So when you're talking about an enterprise environment, so they already have invested heavily in their existing infrastructure, right? Not just in terms of the compute environment, be it the compute layer or storage or the network component, but even in terms of how their users are being authenticated in their existing environment. And now when we propose a cloud-based flavor, right? So it's kind of unlearning all what we have learned for the past few decades now, for if you see it from an enterprise point of view. So for them it's something like that, which is not the case, right? Because cloud is embracing the best of both worlds. If you are an enterprise, you can bring in your existing environment and have a sort of a hybrid deployment and make sure that you are coexisting with your cloud-based environment and still getting the best of both worlds. While if you are a small or a mid-sized business, then again cloud is the right choice for you, especially if I talk about a SaaS flavor like Office 365, because it means that you as a small organization can utilize all the services that few years ago were quite kind of unimaginable. For example, if I talk about having your own uh, corporate email for a small organization, right? So an organizational ID, in order to have that, back in the day we had to deploy a dedicated exchange server, which was kind of unimaginable for a small organization, or let's say for example a startup. But now with all these mail services along with many other components bundled together in a single suite of application called as Office 365, you have the the enterprise class quality at your disposal, and that too on a pay as you go model, and that too on a monthly subscription basis. So today's session would specifically focus on planning of an Office 365 deployment from a point of view of an enterprise. Because if you're a standalone user, or as I said, if you're a small or a mid-sized business, so you just go ahead and you start utilizing the SaaS services and cloud as a whole. But when you're talking about an enterprise, they need to plan very effectively. They need to perform a variety of checks to ensure that there is a pretty smooth transition in their cloud transformation journey. And I hope by the time the session ends, I'll be able to enlighten you all. Not completely, but yes, this will give you a good head start in terms of understanding that what are the key areas that you need to consider, what are the key factors that you need to take into consideration prior to planning an Office 365 enterprise deployment. Right, so this is going to be a 1 hour session. Let's try to keep it interactive. So if you have any questions, again, due to paucity of time, we might not be able to answer it, all the queries then and there. But I think as Etisham, beg your pardon, has already shared on the chat panel that you can relay your queries over there, and I'll try to answer them on the fly. Right, so let's try to keep this session as interactive as possible, so that we all can mutually learn from each other, from the best practices that perhaps you might be following in your organization, which, let's say, I might be oblivious to, or something that I can tell you based upon my experience, which primarily is the intent of today's session, and ensure that we all have a fruitful learning across the period of next 1 hour. So, on a higher level, the session is primarily divided into three key areas, focusing on first, the planning around the Office 365 identity, because we have been used to utilizing our existing on-premise authentication in the form of Windows Server Active Directory or an LDAP-based directory. But the reason why we needed a cloud-based directory in the form of Azure in the first place was that those traditional directories don't support or are not pretty much compatible with cloud hosted modern day applications. And that's why there was a need to evolve that authentication provider. And that's how we had Azure AD. And planning for Office 365 identity, in my opinion, is one of the most crucial tasks while planning your enterprise deployment in Office 365. Reason being, because this is the key area which you need to plan very carefully, how your hybrid identity model would look like, whether you to go ahead with the directory synchronization scenario, whether to go ahead with a federated authentication scenario, or now, as some of you might be aware, we also have a scenario wherein we can achieve something called as pass-through authentication, which is a kind of a federated authentication, but without the deployment complexities associated with an ADFS-based federated authentication. So we'll talk about that. What are the factors that you need to consider while planning for the same? Then we'll talk about very crucial aspect, which is the Office 365 network planning, wherein again, since we are utilizing a service over the web, so utilization, a, a due consideration is to be given to the network planning also, be it in terms of the increase in the in the bandwidth load, or in terms of the network connectivity from your user sites to cloud, and again multiple other scenarios which we'll touch down upon. And towards the end, we'll talk about implementing your domain services, right, which majorly talks about a hybrid deployment scenario, wherein how you can set up your own custom domains on cloud, how you need to take care into you need to take into consideration the key factor of having your own custom domain in cloud, which is actually the same domain running in your local Active Directory in case you go ahead with a hybrid authentication deployment. So this is more or less the crux of today's session that we intend to cover up today. So with that said, without any further ado, we'll quickly jump on to the first part of our session, which is about planning your Office 365 identity or planning your Office 365 experience. Right, and as I said, it's very crucial to have a planning around this particular factor. But prior to that, it's also important to understand how to plan your Office 365 subscription, right? Because again, a due consideration needs to be given to this part as well. Reason being that you are again, there are multiple options to choose from. There are multiple subscription options for you to choose from, each of the subscription having its own set of components. So it's very important to identify, to investigate the area as to which Office 365 services that you plan to use. Right. So your first action when planning for Office 365 is examining all the available subscriptions and determining which one best suits your organization's requirement. Because for your organizational end users, remember, there would be hundreds of thousands of end users for whom you will be paying that subscription for. So you need to strike the right balance between the services that you utilize and your users would be requiring, and the right pricing for the same. Again, the pricing depending upon which Office 365 license edition you opt for. It's pretty much standard, right? But If you go for let's say a premium edition of, let's say, Azure Active Directory, for example, right, which might help you achieve a lot, but let's say the scenario is that the task that you want to achieve on cloud is something that you can, let's say, achieve simply with a standard Azure Active Directory. So in that case, there won't be a requirement to purchase a more expensive SKU of your Azure Active Directory. Likewise for Office 365, right? Again, we have different plans like Office 365 Business, Office 365 Education, Office 365 Enterprise, each having its own set of services, most of which pretty much remain the same. For example, Exchange Mailbox would be pretty much part of almost every subscription, if I were to say. Then your Office applications, right, which falls under the Office 365 Pro Plus category. So some of the applications, because think of Office 365 not as an application but as a suite of applications, right? So if you choose a subscription that offers more than you need, you end up paying for services and features that you never use. For example, Visio is something that not everyone would be requiring, but if you opt for an edition which includes Visio also, so you are paying more than what more than what you can achieve your desired task with. Likewise, conversely, if you choose a subscription just based on the price, you might not have the features and services to meet your organizational requirements. So to prepare for your Microsoft Office 365 environment, you must become familiar with the functionality and subscriptions provided by each Microsoft 365 plan, whether it's an Microsoft Office 365 Business plan, whether it's an Office 365 Enterprise plan, or an Office 365 Education plan that you're opting for. So this is the first due consideration that you need to give to. And again, because it said that well begun is half the job done. So if you're planning pretty meticulously around the part that as to how to ensure that you have the most optimum edition of your Office 365 service, right? So the preceding task would kind of be cakewalk. So ensure that you give a due thought, a due diligence to choosing the right subscription for your enterprise. Post that, again, remember, so please keep in mind that all the scenarios that we are talking about might not be applicable to, let's say, every kind of business. For a small organization, for a user that is born in the cloud, which does not have any sort of a hybrid deployment, so they don't need to give consideration to migration. But remember, the session is about an enterprise deployment. So again, giving due thought to, and also ensuring that there's a meticulous planning around the migration piece of office of your existing environment prior to migration to Office 365 is a very crucial aspect. So you need to plan your migration in a very effective manner. For example, let's say that you recently purchased Office 365 and you decide to implement it right away. A couple of weeks later, you realize that you need to manually type your username and password many times a day while using Office 365. So this particular scenario, and various other scenarios like this, can happen when you don't take the time to plan for an optimal migration to Office 365. So to maximize your organization's chances of a successful Office 365 migration, it is important for you to plan appropriately and examine all the steps needed to complete a migration. So first things first, decide which plan or which plans meet your organization's requirement. Because as I said, depending upon the requirements of your end users and your organization, it's important to choose the right sort of plan. And again, a single organization can mix different Office 365 plans according to its business requirements. For example, an organization can purchase, let's say, 200 enterprise editions, whereas it can purchase, let's say, 100 business premium editions of Microsoft of Office 365. So that's a crucial part. Then inventory the current environment in the organization, because it involves identifying the number of user accounts and the number and size of mailboxes, as well as collecting other information such as client versions, configurations, internet sites to migrate, which process, which method in fact to choose for your mailbox migration depending upon your requirement. So it could be a cutover migration, it could be an IMAP based migration, or it could be a simple ad hoc migration to Exchange Online in Office 365. And you need to give pretty due consideration, pretty due thought to all this aspect, right? Determine how you will create or synchronize accounts, whether you'll be using a directory synchronization based process, how your cloud based Office 365 environment will be handling the user authentication. So these are the key areas, right? Like configuring the Office 365 subscription, right? Setting up accounts and mailboxes, kind of creating a foundation on cloud prior to migrating your on premise data. So these are some of the basic checklists, that you need to perform, right? And if you plan this aspect pretty well, your journey, your transformation journey to cloud would be quite seamless, right? So remember, this is not an exhaustive list, because again, this is not a one size fits all or a one shoe fits all scenario we are talking about, because different environment, different enterprises or different organizations, they have different scenarios. But on an overview level, so at least giving due thought to this level of information would ensure that your journey would be quite seamless. So ensure that you're planning your migration to Microsoft 365 pretty seamlessly. So again, I have been talking throughout the fact that how we are focusing specifically on the aspect of Office 365, right, wherein we are talking about a federated identity sort of a scenario. So the reason being because for enterprises, these are the scenarios that we'll be dealing in with, unlike a small or a mid-sized organization which has its identity only in the cloud. So that brings me to the first kind of enterprise identity which we usually might have, right? So the first scenario is cloud only identity, which is pretty standard, as we know, as you all know. So wherein we are just focusing on leveraging these services on cloud. But remember, as I've said multiple times, this particular session is about an enterprise deployment. So our focus would primarily be around planning directory synchronization, or understanding the federated identity scenario. So that brings me to the first kind of scenario, wherein which suits most of the enterprises, that is the directory synchronization scenarios. For enterprises who have identity outside their cloud environments as well. So it's important to understand the overall process of how directory synchronization takes place. And as I said earlier on, the reason we needed a cloud hosted directory like Azure AD in Office 365 was the reason because the existing on-premise directories like Azure, like Windows Server Active Directory, beg your pardon, won't or is not actually able to authenticate your users in the cloud, because as we know, most of the modern day applications do not support those protocols that probably Windows Server AD uses. For example, it uses Kerberos authentication protocol. So that is something that your Windows Server Active Directory does not or cannot take care of. So it's important, and it's imperative in that cases for enterprises who already have an existing Windows Server AD. How do they integrate the two? And that's where the directory and password hash synchronization comes in as a very handy method. Reason being, when you talk about this scenario, so what happens over here is that for enterprises who already have invested heavily in their existing Windows Server AD environment, they can ensure that they are giving their users same set of identities in cloud and in on-prem by implementing directory synchronization, which ensures that the users have the same set of identities in on-prem or cloud. So this is something we don't call as single sign-on. This is something we call as same sign-on. So herein, what happens is that let's say when a user is trying to access his resources on the cloud. So therein, every time he's trying to access or retrieve any of these resources, right? The user uh, in a non-directory synchronization scenario would have to enter his password a different password on cloud and a different password in on-prem, right? So in to avoid this kind of a scenario, what Azure AD or Microsoft proposes is that you have you utilize the same identity that you have in on-prem and bring it to cloud, which ensures that your users don't have to remember multiple identities in on-prem and in cloud, thereby ensuring that your same set of identities can work with both set of scenarios. So what happens over here is, let's say when a user is trying to log in to his cloud hosted services, cloud hosted Office 365 services, right? The authentication would go to Windows Azure Active Directory service, right? Wherein the users would be the user, the service would in turn relay the application, relay back that authentication request back to the on-premise environment. And how exactly do we achieve that? So it happens via the process of directory synchronization. Because herein what's happening is that your users, since they have the same set of identities both in on-prem and in cloud, so this ensures that they don't have to re-enter their user credentials over and over again. So herein, when the authentication is request is being relayed to Windows, Azure, and cloud, the request is sent back, not sent back, but what happens over here is that since an engine like directory synchronization through Azure AD Connect has already replicated those set of identities in cloud, your users don't have to enter multiple username and password. So this is the second scenario. The first scenario, of course, by default is the cloud only identity. The second scenario is directory and password hash synchronization. So what's happening over here is that your users, the authentication is taking place in cloud, but all right. So it's a wonderful question, although not exactly in the context of what we are discussing. So the question is that how does Office 365 handle two-factor authentication? So Office 365 and just about any SaaS service that Microsoft has to offer on cloud, behind the scene, it uses Azure AD as a default directory. Now, Azure AD utilizes a service called as a multi-factor authentication service, a service that is built by Microsoft to take care of multi-factor authentication. So, by in Office 365, when you sign up for the services, you need to enable multi-factor authentication on an enterprise-wide basis through a multi-factor authentication tenant, which is enabled by default in Azure Active Directory. So, you need to enable it either on an enterprise-wide basis or on a per-user basis, and the users can then every time they try to sign on to their Office 365 resources, they'll either get an OTP on their text or a call on their device, or even they can authenticate themselves using a multi-factor authentication app, right? Which gives you that kind of a boarding pass, right, to sign on to your cloud service. So there is a multi-factor authentication service built in Azure, in Azure Active Directory. And when I say Azure Active Directory, it also implies Office 365, because behind the scene, uh, Office 365 also uses Azure Active Directory as an identity provider. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, Ashish, you may continue. I think
All right,
Stefan is
sure.
happy with the
Yeah,
answers.
thanks. Yeah, okay, all right. So this is the, just again, please bear in mind when we are talking about cloud identities, there are three scenarios. First one being cloud only identity, which would suffice for a small organization. But as I said, this is the enterprise level deployment that we are talking of. So herein what happens is that we'll be discussing the directory synchronization aspect, and then we'll move on to the federated authentication aspect. So when I talk of directory synchronization, remember as a thumb rule that all the authentication is happening on cloud, just that the on-premise identity of your user accounts in your from your Windows Server Active Directory as a source has been replicated on cloud. So even though your users are getting authenticated on cloud, they're getting to sign on to their resources, their services in the cloud via the same set of credentials as they do in their existing on-premise environment. Right. So when you're planning directory synchronization, there are a few factors to be taken care of, because herein we need to ensure that the set of identities being sourced from on-prem to cloud, they should be in sync. So there are a few things to bear in mind when you're planning an implementation of directory synchronization, primarily which includes the directory preparation and the other requirements and functionality of the Azure Active Directory. So directory preparation covers a few key areas, and to help ensure a seamless transition to Office 365 using a directory synchronization tool. Remember, in the previous slide also there was a directory synchronization tool, which is the synchronization engine. The latest version of that tool is Azure AD Connect, right? So the entire directory synchronization process is happening through that medium of Azure AD Connect, through that synchronization engine, right? And to ensure that there's a seamless synchronization, we need to first cleanse our environment. And that's where we have a very effective tool called as the directory synchronization ID fix tool. Right. So download this tool. It's a pretty minimal configuration tool. So using this tool, you can clean your Active Directory, right? So that you can remove the duplicate proxy address and user principal name attributes, right? Because as I said, herein we are talking about synchronization from on-prem to cloud. So you need to ensure that there's a consistency in terms of how those user accounts remain in on-prem and cloud. So what this tool does is it cleans your environment by removing duplicate proxy addresses and UPNs, and updates other missing information with the valid principal with the valid attributes. So this is one key area that you need to focus on when you're talking about directory synchronization. And the most common errors that you might come across are have been tabulated in this particular slide. So the error might be related to any of the scenario, right? It could be related to the fact that the characters, right, are they contain a value which is kind of invalid, right? So again, all these errors that you will be coming across, and the error is majorly with regards to how the synchronization is between your on-premise environment and cloud. So here, what all these errors, not just this tool gives, gives you an idea of what these errors are, but also tells you how to remediate them, right? So as you can see, it also provides a suggested fix as to how to overcome the issue associated with that particular tool. So herein, all these issues related to the duplicate identities, related to the formatting of the existing values in your on-prem, right? So, for example, if I talk about a duplicate value, so IDFix tool will edit or remove that value to eliminate duplication, right? It could it will not just give uh, the error, it'll also suggest the right remediation for the same tool. Or let's say the issue could be with regards to the formatting error, right? The value might be violating the format requirements, the for the attribute usage. For example, let's say we have an SMTP address, right, that complies with RFC, with the convention, whichever convention we are talking about here. So if let's say if that format the format in cloud, the SMTP address must comply with certain sort of convention. For example, let's say it cannot start or end with a period or a dot, right? So those kind of errors might be there in because remember here we are talking about an enterprise scale data. So all these are the common sort of errors that you might come across, and the best part is that the tool helps you remediate all of them, or in fact most of them. The error related to the mismatch of the mail attribute or the domain part, or the length of the user attribute that you are synchronizing on cloud, right? So all these attributes, because remember the security principal objects, right? And security principal object simply does not imply only the user account. It includes just about every object that is part of your Windows Server Active Directory. So all these issues, they come into fold, because again, remember, these are not the issues that might plague your environment as a whole, but when you're actually synchronizing the same identities back on cloud. So that's where they might come to the fore, and IDFix helps you do that. So the whatever we have discussed so far now with regards to preparing your identity prior to synchronization holds true not just for the directory synchronization aspect, but also to the secondary aspect, or what we call as the federated authentication scenario as well. So I think most of you would have worked with ADFS servers in the past, because they have existed since Windows Server 2003 R2 days, right? So back in the day, ADFS servers were used to establish trust, and are still used to establish trust between two different Windows Server Active Directory. Now, the same familiar ADFS component is also utilized to extend that trust between your on-premise environment and cloud. So unlike directory synchronization, wherein we had same set of credentials in on-prem and in cloud. So remember, when you're talking about directory synchronization, the authentication is still happening in cloud. But when we're talking about a federated identity scenario, the entire authentication is getting processed in your on-premise environment. So similar to directory synchronization, the directory sync engine still holds there, because the first step of arriving at directory synchronization is to have a common set of identities both in on-prem and cloud. So first things first, you'll need to run a directory synchronization engine to ensure that these identities across your on-premise environment and cloud, they are replicated. But on top of that, you have, or you will need, an ADFS server component which will establish a one-way trust. Remember the keyword one way, because the synchronization is from your on-prem to cloud, not the other way around. So this one-way trust once established, so next time around when your user tries to sign on to his Office 365 service, his authentication request will get redirected to ADFS server, meaning that he does not even need to re-enter his user credentials. In very simple terms, if I were to explain, so let's say if I come to my organization every morning and I log onto my domain network using my Windows Server AD credentials. Now, when I type in mail.office365.com or portal.office365.com on the address bar of my web browser, so usually I'll have to enter my credentials, including my username and password. But if you have a federated identity scenario, as soon as I type in my username, the authentication request will get redirected back to my local domain controller residing in my on-prem via an ADFS web proxy server. And if I'm logged into my domain network, I won't even have to re-enter my user password, giving me the most seamless, or what we call as the federated seamless single sign-on, or SSO, as we know it in familiar terms. So with federated single sign-on, again, of course, there's more complexity to it, but this is the truest form of what we call as the single sign-on. All right, so one of the participants have asked this question, that what is the frequency to run the DirSync engine to sync Azure AD with the on-premise Active Directory, and where we can set up the frequency, right? So yeah, so what happens or again, so the default interval of directory synchronization. So again, once you run the directory synchronization tool, for example, if you're running the Azure AD Connect tool for the very first time, it's not something that you need to run over and over again, because it once you run that, it installs the Azure AD connector and many other corresponding services. And every 3 hour, it adds on those incremental, any, let's say if you make any kind of changes in your existing on-premise environment. So every 3 hour, all those changes will be synced back on cloud. So that is the default interval. But with the latest version of the Azure AD Connect combined with the Azure AD Premium, that frequency is now set to the default frequency is now 30 minutes. Again, it's a very recent change. As to where we can set up that frequency. So yeah, so within again, this is not something that you do on a tool based basis, right? This is not something that you do from a tool, but when you install the Azure AD Connect or the synchronization engine on your local on-premise server, So there are a few values that you need to update, like in the Azure AD connector. It kind of creates a registry where you need to update that value of default 3 hours, or now which is 30 minutes now, to whichever value that you want to set up. Although it's not a best practice, so again I would recommend that do not set up that frequency. Let it be the default interval of 3 hours or 30 minutes, depending upon which version of Azure AD Connect you are using. So the default interval by default is 3 hours. So do not set that interval. As for the other question regarding whether the authentication, okay, let me just read those questions. Okay, so yeah, there are no open questions.
So there's another question about seamless. Does
Yeah.
seamless single sign-on also apply to Unix-based operating systems as
Yeah.
well?
All right.
Or
So interesting question. Thanks for asking, Stephen. So again, remember that when we're talking about a single sign-on, specifically with regards to Kerberos protocol, that is the default authentication protocol that Windows Server uses, right? So as I said, as again I kind of gave away the answer in the while saying my while making these comments a while back. So Kerberos authentication protocol only works with your Windows Server Active Directory environment, which is what is working when we are configuring a hybrid authentication, which means that it works only with Windows clients only to achieve the seamless single sign-on, because the Kerberos authentication protocol that we are talking about, right, or the mechanism, the underlying protocol that we are talking about, it only supports it works with the Windows Server Active Directory environment. And as we know, Windows Server Active Directory is the default authentication provider of Windows clients. So yes, it only works with the Windows environment. So I hope this answers your query. All right. So again, this is the true form of federated single sign-on. Remember, the most complex one to deploy. But again, since the session is about enterprise deployment, right? So this is something pretty which we see on a very usual basis, because although the environment, the synchronization process is pretty secure, but some organizations might want the entire authentication process to happen in their on-premise. Which brings me to one part which I somehow missed in the previous slide. Apologies for that. The process of synchronization, right? So remember, when I'm talking about synchronization process, right, and this holds for the previous directory synchronization process also, plus the federated authentication scenario as well. So herein, while the actual directory synchronization process is taking place, remember that the synchronization engine does not store your plain text passwords in cloud, right? The synchronization process, it utilizes a technology called as password hash synchronization, which means that the synchronization engine, while the synchronization is being run for the first time, applies a mathematical hash function on your plain text passwords. And the value that it generates, that the functional value that the hash function generates, that value is stored in cloud. So the next time when you sign in, when you enter your credentials back on cloud, the same hash function is applied on your your simple plain text value, and the new value, the new hash value which is generated while you enter your credential, it is compared with your cloud stored repository of your password hash value. If there is a match, you're allowed to sign in. So this should also remove the apprehension for the enterprises, who might be kind of not very sure about using directory synchronization, because they think that synchronization means movement of plain text passwords back on cloud, right? So remember, bear in mind that we there's a reason why we call it as a password hash synchronization, right? So this is how the synchronization process works like.
So another question we've got, it says, is that a simple MD5 hash or something more secure?
All right. So for this question, I think this is kind of pretty. It is so when you're synchronizing your password. So it indeed is an MD5 hash only, right? So again, but the idea is that it kind of ensures that the not your plain text password is being stored on the cloud, but yes, the hash value is the mechanism being used is an MD5 hash only. So we do have very intelligent audience with us, right? Already knowing a lot of questions, the answers to a lot of the questions. So again, I really appreciate the participative nature of the audience. So, but yes, since we are a bit short on time, so we'll quickly move on to the next part. So again, when we're talking about planning an EDFS deployment, so not a lot changes. As I said earlier on, this is pretty much the same ADFS servers that we have been used to working in with for decades now. So it's important to identify your ADFS deployment goals, because remember, ADFS deployment, although with the introduction of Windows Server 2012 and beyond, the configuration and installation of ADFS role is pretty forward. But again, when I say ADFS, there are a lot of components that it utilizes, right? So it's important to understand the factors that you need to consider while planning your ADFS based deployment, because it's important to understand which all ADFS roles are there, right? Because not every deployment of ADFS would require, let's say, an ADFS server farm, or not every deployment would need, let's say, an ADFS web proxy or a customized ADFS user sign in. So you simply need to first, likewise, as when we began the session, we talked about doing a certain level of brainstorming with regards to choosing the right subscription plan. Likewise, prior to planning an ADFS deployment, identify which are the important roles that your whole federation scenario would require, whether you need to configure an ADFS server farm, which is let's say not always needed, right? So it's pretty imperative that you identify your actual requirements and then map them with what the ADFS role as a whole has to offer, right? Because again, as I said, there are multiple roles. So federation service is the ADFS service, which is the role that is it it is the component that acts as an identity provider by authenticating users and redirecting them to provide security tokens to applications which can trust ADFS. Then we have an ADFS server farm, which is a combination of multiple ADFS servers running the federation service role. So federation service is actually the ADFS server role, because remember, in Windows Server environment, every uh, not mechanism, but every capability you achieve is achieved by installing a feature or a rule. So ADFS is nothing but a role in Windows Server environment, and Federation Service is that service that does that. And when I say Federation Server Farm, when you want to provide a redundancy or kind of a DR or resiliency to your environment, you can configure multiple Federation Server Farms just to kind of ensure a high availability, especially if the number of your end users is a bit high, a bit on the higher side. So you can configure a Federation Server Farm. Then you have a web application proxy, which is the component, a web server that you deploy in a DMZ zone, because this is the component that provides the extranet access to applications, right? And ensuring that it's kind of able to relay the communication from outside network back to your local Active Directory environment, and likewise process or have that incoming request being sent from AD without kind of breaching that DMZ boundary. So you deploy a web server in a DMZ zone as a best practice. So these are some of the rules. So Federation Server Farm is something you wouldn't be deploying usually unless you are you want to provide a sort of a resiliency to your entire deployment. But Federation Service and Web Application Proxy is something which you would be needing. Likewise, as a thumb rule, although there's no set criteria as to how many servers can cater to how many number of users, but as your requirements, as the number of your users scale in cloud. So accordingly, you also need to have a dedicated number of federation servers alongside a dedicated number of app servers. So if you have less than 1,000 user to cater to, so in that case, there won't be a requirement to go ahead and deploy a dedicated federation server. You can have an ADFS server co-hosted on a DC itself. Likewise, the ADFS role can also be installed on a web server without having to deploy a web server on in a DMZ zone, right? Because many enterprises might not have a dedicated DMZ zone to cater to. But yes, ensure that you are providing a dedicated network load balancer to load balance the federation server proxies. However, if you have more than 1,000 users but less than 15,000 users, ensure that you have at least two dedicated federation servers configured in the federation server farm, because a single federation server might not be able to cater to all the authentication requests. Likewise, two dedicated web servers catering to each of the federation servers. But if you have more than 15,000 users, in that case you can choose anywhere between 3 to 5 dedicated federation servers, right? Although in that case also you can have two dedicated web servers, but yes, again, if the intent is to provide more resiliency, you can opt for more as more number of app servers as well. So these are some of the factors which you need to take care of with regards to planning your identity on cloud, right? Because identity, as I said, it's a very key aspect of your entire enterprise level deployment. Because when I say enterprise, it itself is a giveaway that the organization already has an identity in cloud, and synchronizing that and ensuring that the coexistence is pretty seamless and also beneficial to the end users becomes pretty much crucial. And that's why it's important to and that's why we talked about the fact that how to plan your identity prior to migration to Office 365. Or this is actually an ongoing process, so this is not just that will continue prior to your migration, that will end prior to your migration, but this is kind of an ongoing process. So these are some of the factors that you need to take care of. And the second most crucial aspect that you need to take care of is your network planning. Because Office 365, as we know, as I've said multiple times by now, is a managed service designed to work in any environment, but something that you access over the web. So even though there's no set bandwidth requirement to operate in the cloud, it's a good practice to optimize your environment to create Office 360, to create Office the stability. Because using Office 365 might increase the utilization of your organization's internet circuit. So there are a few tasks that you can perform. Again, not an exhaustive list, because as I said, when you're talking about an enterprise deployment, it's not a one size fits all scenario, because different enterprises have different use cases, different scenarios, right? But on a higher level, this is the bare minimum that you should do and that you need to do to at least ensure that the network bandwidth requirements are optimally understood. So, of course, assess the number of clients that will use each internet egress, right? Determine as to which Office 365 services and features will be available for clients to use, right? Because, for example, if I talk about a service like Exchange Online, so not every organization or not very few enterprises, uh, uh, not enterprises, beg your pardon, but the users would be accessing those mails over mail.office 365, right? Either they'll be doing it over their Outlook mailbox or across their mobile device applications, right? So in those cases, you if you know that there's not a lot of access to your network based Office 365 services, so accordingly you can optimally plan your bandwidth requirement within your environment. But this is a very small piece of the larger picture. The larger picture being testing the existing network that you already have. And Microsoft does help you in that in that regard pretty effectively, because network is not just testing or understanding the network requirement is not just from a utilization point of view, but more critically from a migration point of view. Microsoft provides you with various tools which are designed to help you to determine the capability of the network needed for not just migration, but also utilization after they're fully deployed, but majorly from a migration point of view. And I'm sure a lot of you might have worked with it. For example, Microsoft Remote Connectivity Analyzer. This is a tool that I've seen since past 8 9 years. I've personally used it, and I've in one of the major exchange on-prem migration that I did to cloud. So tools like Microsoft Message Analyzer, for example, if I talk about Message Analyzer, so it's an effective tool for troubleshooting your network issues because it captures, it displays, and analyzes your messaging traffic and system messages, also allowing you to import, aggregate, and analyze data from different log and trace files. Then we have Microsoft Remote Connectivity Analyzer, which lets you test connectivity in your Exchange Online environment, thereby giving you a complete list of tasks that that you have the list of tasks that you have successfully cleared prior to performing that migration. So Microsoft Remote Connectivity Analyzer does that to you, also working across different kind of migration methods, be it an IMAP migration or be it a cutover migration. So this is a very effective tool which I've been using personally over the years in a lot of deployments. Then we have something called as Microsoft Support and Recovery Assistant for Office 365, which is a recent tool, but this is something that majorly works with your Outlook issues. So this can help you automatically diagnose and fix a wide range of Outlook related problems. So these are some of the existing tools that are provided by Microsoft to ensure that you map or that you understand your network requirements pretty effectively. Other than that, there are certain best practices for integrating your environment to Office 365, right? So remember that Office 365 network traffic performs best, when it's treated as a trusted internet service, and it's allowed to bypass much of the traditional filtering, right? So that's when it performs best. So this typically includes, let's say, removing scenarios like an outbound processing, such as a proxy user authentication, as well as ensuring, for example, that let's say a local egress to the internet with the proper NAT translation. So these kind of scenarios, if you allow your Office 365 environment to bypass this, so this is going to perform best. And again, it's not a trade-off between security and your the ease of usage for your end users, because again, with the wide range of security controls inbuilt in cloud and in Office 365, that security still holds, right? So on an overview level, these considerations would include ensuring that the proxy and firewall devices are configured to handle the additional traffic, right? Because the additional traffic going to Office 365 will result in an increase of outbound proxy connections, as well as an increase in secure traffic, whether over an SSL or a TLS protocol. Likewise, if your outbound proxies require user authentication, you may experience slow connectivity or a loss of functionality. So bypassing the authentication requirement for the Office 365 domains can reduce this overhead. And that's why it's important to have your own, sort of a custom domain in cloud. Likewise, if you have many shared calendars and mailboxes, you may see an increase in number of connections from Outlook to Exchange. So in this situation, ensure that the egress proxy can handle the connections or bypass the proxy for connections to Office 365 for Outlook. So these are some of the best practices, but not specifically restricted to these, right? But yes, this more or less covers your major network planning prior to integrating your environment to uh, to Office 365. To summarize, what kind of deployment you would to model to go ahead with Office 365, especially from a hybrid authentication point of view. So again, this table summarizes where exactly what process is happening. So if I'm talking about password hash synchronization plus seamless single sign-on, the entire authentication is happening in the cloud. Whereas when I'm talking about pass-through authentication, which is a pretty new feature, plus seamless single sign-on, so herein the authentication is happening in the cloud, but after a secure verification with your on-premise authentication agent, which is your domain controller. So this is very similar. The second scenario is very similar to ADFS, and the magic is that it does not need an ADFS deployment. Then we have federation with ADFS, which happens in on-premise itself. So this is kind of summarizing the comparison between different kind of mechanisms, right, as to when a certain kind of mechanism works like. And this is just a brief comparison of the same, which we have already discussed and already covered in the previous slides. So network planning, remember, holds a very crucial, a very it should be a very important part of your entire migration strategy, right? Because we are using a SaaS service over the network, right? We are using performing the entire migration over uh, a service over the network. So giving due diligence, giving due consideration to your network planning should be pretty imperative and should form a very crucial part of your entire network planning scenario. So we have talked about planning for your identity. We have talked about planning for your network. Another key aspect is how we plan or how we implement our domain services. So think of this part of our session as a subset of the first session itself, right? Which was about the identity part. When you're talking about identity, when you're talking about a federated identity or a directory synchronization identity, so within that, we also need to implement or plan to implement our domain services. And that's where it's important to understand how to plan your custom domain. Because remember, when you are performing a directory synchronization, like for example, let's say when you sign up for an Office 365 service, let's say if it's a trial account. So in that case, your domain, for example, in on-premise, you are using a domain like editum.com. Whereas on cloud, when you are signing up, you're getting a domain like editum.onmicrosoft.com. So if you want to have same sign-on or a single sign-on scenario provided to your end users via federated authentication, you also need to ensure that the domains in on-prem and in cloud are same. So the domain that you opt for, with regards to usage with your Office 365 services, has to be your own custom domain, not the default domain that you get with when signing up for Microsoft Office 365. So there are a few thoughts that you need to take care of. Not thought majorly as highlighted in the slide, but a few factors are already there. For example, in any enterprise domain, right, there would be multiple domains. There would be a root domain. There would be multiple other child domains as well. So ensure that you're planning to add the main domain, that your company uses along with any other domain that it uses for email messages within the organization, right? So this scenario is pretty common when, let's say, the overall company is a business group, it's a business entity, or the organization has been through a merger process, and some employees still have alternative email addresses. So in that case, you ensure that all the multiple domains are added to your Office 365 subscription. You might want to register subdomains as well, because as I said, a local enterprise Active Directory environment would be having a root domain, then multiple other domains within it. So again, depending upon which service or which end users utilize which particular domain to access these components in cloud, you need to ensure that all these domains are added as your own custom domains and verified on cloud as well. Then other factors like domain adding order or DNS record hosting also are pretty crucial, right? Again, something as small, which might seem pretty trivial, like whether you have access to the DNS console or not, this is also pretty crucial. Because if I'm talking about a scenario of if you sign up for your own custom domain, right, so you ideally would be having that access. But in certain cases, you might not, a lot of domain providers don't give you that luxury. So in those cases, you can for example, if your DNS hosting organization does not provide that level of access, you might have to send a request to the DNS hosting provider to change the DNS records needed for your Office 365 deployment. Because not just you need to sign up for a custom domain, you also need to verify that by adding a TXT or a mail exchanger record to your Office 365 portal to verify that you are the owner of that domain itself. Other than that, it's also important to plan for your existing DNS servers, especially when you're using custom domain, because a publicly available DNS zone setup is very important during the Office 365 deployment. right? That especially for organizations that want to use their own custom domains. So by being able to edit records within their DNS zone, organizations prove that they own the DNS zone, so that the Office 365 setup wizard can create the tenant with the organization's custom domain and ensure that the entire name resolution is happening via the DNS server that the enterprise uses. So organizations use internal DNS zones configured on internal DNS servers so that the internal clients can resolve those computer names and any of the services that they are using on cloud. So there are a few options available for hosting the DNS zone for a custom domain if you don't want to implement that name resolution via your own DNS server. So in those cases, let's say you can have a third party provider such as GoDaddy to host the DNS zone for your custom domain. In such a case, you can manage the DNS through a web portal. Even though you still need a way to handle the internal name resolution if you use the name for resources that reside on premises. Or you can host the DNS zone on premises by using or deploying DNS server, right? Something that gives you a complete end-to-end control. But again, this is an enterprise level requirement. So not all the enterprises might have their own dedicated servers, but yes, if you have that, that would be pretty great. That would be pretty awesome. And again, so this is something when you're talking about importance of a DNS server or how crucial it is to have DNS record propagated, right? Remember, bear in mind, we are talking about this utilization will only be handy when we are talking about a hybrid deployment, whether a directory synchronization or a federated authentication scenario. For a standalone user, who is just using Office 365 services, he might not have to pay uh, a thought to these kind of additional overheads, right? But yes, if you are enterprise, there would be other there are these DNS requirements that you need to cater to, and all different kind of records, different kind of services utilize different kind of records. For example, uh, DNS records for Exchange Online, they are heavily reliant on mail exchanger record, right? Because this is primarily needed to ensure the SMTP communication between Exchange Online and Office 365 and the mail servers on the web. Likewise, CNAME record. So Outlook client should be using this record to locate the auto discover service in Microsoft 365. Likewise, this Skype for Business Online would be using the SRV or the service record, which is used for SIP Federation. It's also used to coordinate the flow of communication between Skype for Business clients as well. So these are the various kind of records that your DNS that your application would be requiring from a DNS service point of view, and including your mobile device management for Office 365. And we are not talking about Intune over here. We are talking about the default MDM capabilities in Office 365. Right. So CNAME records become pretty crucial in those kind of scenario. So it's important that you give due thought to planning for DNS record requirements as well, and ensure that your preparation for the entire hybrid enterprise deployment is pretty seamless. It's pretty well on track, right? So this is what we discussed in this part of the session as to planning uh, to implement the custom domains in Office 365, right? Remember, as I've said multiple times, this is an enterprise deployment that we are talking about, and all the factors that we covered up, be it the network part, be it the identity piece, or be it the DNS records part, right? So they are all hold very critical value in your planning while migrating to Office 365. So I've tried my best to make this session as comprehensive in terms of content from an enterprise deployment point of view, right? And with that said, we come to an end to today's discussion. And I would like to thank all the participants for their participation in today's session. I hope this session was helpful to you guys, and in ensuring that it was able to, at least for starters, for those of you who are new to Office 365 deployment as a whole, I hope this session was beneficial. Also, you can, as a recommendation, you can go and explore Microsoft Fast Track for Office 365, which is a program which Microsoft has of its own to increase the end user adoption of Office 365 services on cloud, giving you various benefits, giving you a kind of a hand holding with regards to your journey on cloud in Microsoft in Office 365, so that you can drive value out of the entire proposition. Right. So all the tasks that we have covered up in today's session. So when you get started in the fast track program, in the fast track center portal, so your fast track engineer will run checks to identify any readiness task your infrastructure requires prior to onboarding. Right. So you'll be notified about any task that you or your preferred partner must complete before you can begin the onboarding process. So all these capabilities that you would ideally be doing on your own prior to the entire deployment or preparing the entire deployment environment is something that fast track with Microsoft, it's kind of guiding you on the right path, right? So there's a lot of fast track supported capabilities that you can utilize. So
All
this is
right.
just added as an appendix, not part of the main session, but I would recommend that you go ahead and explore the Microsoft 365 program.
All right. Thank you, Ashish. That was a very educational session. Thank you, everyone, for attending. If you guys have any questions, you can always reach out to us at Expert Connect, expertconnect.quickstart.com, or you can just drop an email to marketing@quickstart.com, and we will take care of it. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and see you guys next time. Thank you.